race and anti-racism, even in transcultural contexts. As with translation more broadly, there is a trade imbalance when it comes to the translation of texts around anti-racist organizing or critical theorizations of race. Thus, we can find terms like white privilege, structural racism, intersectionality, and wokeness translated or loaned into a variety of other languages and cultural contexts, with a much smaller reciprocal movement into English of terms and concepts for understanding race from other languages and cultures. The literary representations of people of color also translate out from the US and UK Anglophone literature more than in. John Keane, in his significant essay on race and translation, Translating Poetry, Translating Blackness, underscores the importance of more work by Black authors being translated into English. And this is a long quote from John Keane. This aporia limits our understanding of the range and complexity of Black lives all over the world, and also limits our understanding of forms of living and being, as well as of systems and structures of oppression based on race and ethnicity, indigeneity, class, gender, religious affiliation, etc., have direct parallels globally. Or to put it another way, we have a truer and fuller sense of the Black diaspora and thus the globe when we have translations of the vast body of work out there, end quote. While acknowledging the importance of this work, I want to focus less today on translation as a means to facilitate the transfer of texts and ideas about race from one language and culture to another, and focus instead on translation as a site itself for engagement with race. Again, I'm going to be a little picaresque about this to give a broader sense of this how question. How one translates, how one theorizes translation, and how that can be a part of anti-racist translation scholarship, practice, and pedagogy. I also want to acknowledge that the nature of a talk is not the same citational practice, so I want to acknowledge all of the work and advocacy that especially translators and scholars of color have done, from which I draw a lot of my thinking. Throughout, I'll be discussing the way anti-racist translation theory and practice can challenge translation theory discourse and translation norms and practices, often presented as universal which are instead rooted in frameworks of whiteness and white supremacy. As E. Patrick Johnson has argued in regards to queer theory, the subject who theorizes and the universal subject theorized tend to be white, without a critical reflection on what their whiteness means for their theorization. It has become a commonplace to acknowledge one's positionality as a scholar or translator, as an educated middle-class white woman, without digging more deeply into what difference that positionality makes, for that acknowledgement to sound less like an excuse and more like a call to change one's habits. The how of anti-racist translation theory and practice is not limited to scholars and translators of color, but it involves more than just the what, that is, writing about or translating works that deal with race or translating works by authors of color. So it should be a praxis of anti-racism. The who of translation studies in the West as a field has certainly been overwhelmingly white, despite the transcultural and translingual nature of translation. Many of the scholars of color who brought together post-colonial studies with translation studies in the foundational texts of post-colonial translation studies were not primarily or only trained in translation studies. So for example, Vicente L. Rafael's, who I think everyone taught this morning, Contracting Colonialism, and Tejaswini Niranjana's Citing Translation, so from the late 80s, early 90s. On the other hand, the subsequent consolidation of post-colonial studies within translation studies was largely directed by white translation studies scholars in texts such as Post-Colonial Translation, Theory and Practice, edited by Susan Basnet and Harish Trivedi, Maria Tomachko's Translation in a Post-Colonial Context, Early Irish Literature and English Translation from 1999, and Changing the Terms, Translating in the Post-Colonial Era from 2000, edited by Sherry Simon and Paul St. Pierre. Although post-colonial doesn't always explicitly address the question of race and racialization, taken together, this who's who of early translation studies, post-colonial translation studies, demonstrates one, an early indifference to questions of race and power by leading white scholars of translation studies in the West. Two, the marginalization of scholars of color in translation studies who often emerge in other fields. And three, the co-optation of this line of study by senior white translation studies scholars who consecrate it in the field without necessarily making room for more work by translation studies of color. To this day, most of the major translation studies texts cited in research and taught in courses in the West are by white scholars. Rather than go deeper into the question of who, I'd like to turn to how this who affects the how of translation studies scholarship. As one prominent example, I suggest that the theoretical reader of works in translation tends to be a white bourgeois subject, without that whiteness being named. For instance, the US, UK Anglophone reader, whom Lawrence Venuti argues prefers a domesticated translation that reads fluently, is a white reader passing for a reader or the reader. The violent domestication or subjugation of foreign texts to the aesthetic, ideological, and cultural norms of the target culture can also then be read according to the logic of white supremacy. In Venuti's model, foreignizing translations are those that challenge the ethnocentric imperialism of the receiving Anglophone culture, but mainly in the interests of resistance to aesthetic and ideological norms that still center those norms as the unspoken white audience and the unspoken white audience as the receiver and beneficiary of that resistance. Instead, members of the communities being translated, both at home and in diaspora, could be imagined as the targets of and beneficiaries of resistant, or to decenter the norm, divergent translation practices. I will take up the issue of audience more when I specifically turn to practice, although theory and practice are, as we know at Iowa, interrelated. But I will add here that translators and translation scholars of color have questioned white-centering notions of whom and what their work is for. As Korean translator Anton Hur does, for example, in his piece on the mythical English reader, whose white norms are deferred to in choices about what text to publish in translation and how to translate them. While an anti-racist practice of translation studies scholarship would encourage us to seek out and reevaluate the ways whiteness shapes knowledge, especially in some of the most cited works in the field, it should also cite more work by scholars of color, both inside and outside of translation studies. To engage with and cite the work of scholars of color is not just about the inclusion of a diverse range of scholars, but also about drawing from epistemologies that tend to be excluded or marginalized by the white Western academy. Western translation studies is founded on the one hand in empirical linguistics, and on the other, on the romantic ideal of sympathetic genius, wherein the translator assumes the place of the author through the power of imagination. Both of these methodologies place an emphasis on the individual and the individual mind who exercises a particular kind of masterful creativity or data analysis. As is common throughout the Western Academy more broadly, translation studies largely excludes other forms of knowledge and knowledge production, especially those centered not only in the mind, but the body or body-mind, and not only in the individual, but in the community, such as embodied knowledge, intuition, and storytelling. As an example of a scholar of color whose work asks us to envision the how of scholarship otherwise, we could turn to historian Saidiya Hartman, who narrativizes the lives of enslaved Black people through a combination of archival research and imagination, since the available empirical written archival documents about these lives are sparse. How might we reconceive narratives of translation and colonialism by performing a similar sort of hybrid historical narrativization of the lives of figures like La Malinche and the countless other, largely to us nameless, indigenous translators and interpreters in colonized lands, on slaving ships and plantations. An anti-racist reimagining of the historical practice of translation, its readers, its norms that aims to dislodge the whiteness at the center of translation theory and practice in the West also leads us to a transformed idea of what translation is and does. While cultural, post-colonial feminist and queer translation studies have investigated in detail the ways that translation can be used to create and maintain unequal and even deadly power imbalances, translation is still often popularly idealized as a transcendence of difference towards a universal humanism. In response to the Gorman controversy, for example, writer and translator Jhumpa Lahiri expressed in an interview, this is a long quote from Lahiri, "It goes against what translation at heart really is." So Reineveld being removed from the project, even though he was not removed. It goes against what translation at heart really is, which is a bringing together of those who are different and don't know one another's experiences vis-a-vis language. What's beautiful and powerful and ethically valuable about translation is this intense attention to the other, and not only attention, but an identification with a sort of transference, end quote. Translation here is framed as transcendent of difference, as inherently, or at least at heart, good. The discussion around the Gorman controversy led many white translators to wring their hands, not only about the idea of having to share already limited resources, supporting literary translation and publication, but also at the idea that their work translating authors of color might not be at heart good. Various short studies have shown, though, that white translators often exclude or soften racialized dialects or depictions of racism, particularly anti-Blackness, a veritable whitewashing of translated texts, as but one example of the way whiteness and white supremacy frame the practice of translation in the West. I'm happy to provide some citations if people are interested in those. By adhering to the frame of transcending difference in the ideal of universal humanism, translation can also function as a type of epistemic violence, where again, the universal is actually the norms of whiteness. Edouard Glissant argues that understanding, his word comprendre, or grasping the other is an act of reduction and appropriation, which we might characterize here as an assimilation to the frames of whiteness, to which he opposes the right to opacity that makes recourse, quote, not to humanity with a capital H, but to the exultant divergence of humanities, end of quote. Similarly, Hairani Baroka writes about the right to access, which is often seized by white-centered cultural and political imperialism or capitalism, as opposed to the right to refusal to be translated, the refusal to be translated, to have one's culture extracted and commodified. Patricia Hill Collins notes the way that the right to refusal may be exercised in the interest of anti-racism, and this is a long quote from Patricia Hill Collins. Translating the ideas of women, Black people, and Indigenous peoples into language that dominant groups can understand may help our individual careers in the academy, but at what cost to ourselves and to the people whose ideas that we translate? The risk we run is that making certain anti-racist and feminist knowledge public may make it easier for dominant groups to manage subordinated groups. What appears to be translation as activism to make subordinated people more respectable can be a form of selling out, end quote. Free of the implicit demands of a supposed white reader, translators of color may then choose to translate otherwise. Kayama L. Glover, who describes herself as an African-American woman of Caribbean descent, had in mind primarily Black US Americans and the Black diaspora in the Anglophone Caribbean, then Anglophone and Creolophone Haitian diaspora readers, and finally other general readers for her translation of the Haitian novel Adriana dans tous mes rêves, or Hadriana in All My Dreams. One of the issues Glover confronted was translating the novel's eroticism for the, quote, relatively puritanical culture of the Anglosphere. After speaking about the novel with students in various contexts, Glover found that first-generation Caribbean American students and others from the Americas writ large appreciated the novel's representations of Caribbean culture, while students at an elite New York university with backgrounds in post-colonial and feminist theory, but who did not have Caribbean heritage, quote, expressed discomfort with the perceived excesses of Depesque's carnivalesque presentation of Vodou and the hypersexualization of the protagonist, end quote. With a different audience in mind than a mainstream white one, translators of color also have greater license to draw from different linguistic, aesthetic, and rhetorical reserves. Sharon Massengale-Bell, for example, explains her decision to translate some of the Creolicized French in a Haitian novel into Black English to recreate the same sense of intimacy of language used among what she calls home people. In one of the only published responses to the Gorman controversy to actually take into account the difference a Black translator would make, Cuban-American writer and translator Ashio Baez also raises the problem of the flattening of African-American vernacular English in the translation of Toni Morrison's Beloved into Spanish, as well as the translation of Slave from Beloved by Serviente, and the N-word as negros, Blacks, another example of whitewashing of anti-Black racism and the horrors of enslavement. The association of Blackness with enslavement has come, I argue, in a chapter of my book, to play a part in norms around translation practice in the West and the way that some translation practices have become racialized. Literal translation, for example, came to pejoratively be called slavish translation around the same time as the transatlantic slave trade, which I contend is no accident. In the romantic ideal of the translator's imaginative genius, the translator masters the source text with their creativity. On the opposing side, Anjali Vats, in her study of race, citizenship, and copyright, has demonstrated that Black people were figured as lacking the faculty of imagination and thus incapable of doing original work that would warrant, for example, the right to authorship or copyright. The injunction for a slavish translation from indigenous and enslaved translators also demands a faithful and literal translation when the colonizer or enslaver could not verify the translation because they did not generally learn African languages. Thus, the norm of the masterful translation that reads fluently and highlights the creativity of the translator rather than the source language or culture can be tied again to frames of white supremacy. The slavish translation persists today in the phenomenon of bridge translation, that is, a practice where a literal translation is prepared by a first language speaker of the source language, then polished into a work of literary art by a writer, often with no knowledge of the source language. Bridge translation, criticized by scholars and translators of color, such as Mona Karim and Yilin Wang, is frequently used for less studied non-European languages where the bridge translator is a person of color and the fluent translator white. Once again, racializing certain types of translation practice. Some current forms of translation advocacy, such as the frequent emphasis in translation studies and literary translation on the visibility of the translator, as in hashtag name the translator or hashtag translators on covers of books, rely on these same romantic ideas of individual authorship and intellectual property that, as Vats has argued, emerge out of white supremacy and racial capitalism. The model of the individual creative genius of the translator, even when relying on the labor of the bridge translation, has given rise to prescriptive ideas in translation training texts about how to translate, often based on the individual experience of the white translator taken as a universal dictum. Such recalcitrant ideas include the belief that fluency in the target language and a flair for literary style is more important than fluency in the source culture and language, and that one should translate into one's dominant or first language, an axiom that will be challenged in the panel just after this on exophonic translation. heritage speakers and immigrants, instead of being seen as having a beneficial special skill set, are stuck in a neither nor, where both their fluency in the target and source languages are considered suspect. When done poorly, the workshop model of translation pedagogy, not here at Iowa, but when done poorly, the workshop model of translation pedagogy may lead to the norming of translations according to standards based in whiteness, especially in white majority workshops, rather than an openness to translations aimed at different audiences and performing different types of work. This is another instance of the who influencing the how of translation, where the inclusion of a diverse set of translators in training may not necessarily result in the transformation of institutional racial hierarchies. Ultimately, what I'd like to argue about translation and anti-racism is that the work of DEI is often co-opted by those in power, be they conservative, neoliberal, or even liberal elite forces, what Olufemi Otaiwo calls elite capture. Elite capture is a top-down approach by institutions that, through the process of gatekeeping, makes marginal adjustments in the who without actually transforming the how. While we should be working within our institutions to teach and publish diverse texts, admit diverse students to programs, and provide equitable working conditions to translators and scholars, the work of translation and anti-racism must come from the bottom up, a chipping away of the very processes of racialization that mask white supremacy as universal, and a radical rethinking of what is possible outside the framework of institutions like the modern university and publishing industry, entangled as they are with white supremacy and racial capitalism. So at the start of this symposium on advocating for DEI in the academy, I'd also sort of like to pose a question about what DEI work can happen in the academy, and what happens by transforming the academy, and what happens outside of the academy, sort of the possibilities and limits of DEI within the academy. I'm happy to answer questions in the Q&A about what some of these radical reimaginings might be. In my book, I talk about the abolition of copyright, for example, and a turn to the Creative Commons. But I'll leave it there and open up for questions. Thank you.
Hi, thank you so much for that talk. It was quite wonderful. And I will have to admit that I'm not very familiar with translation studies. So I was just wondering and thinking through these kind of radical traditions that you ended the talk with, how much possibility is there for kind of co-translation as a process, thinking through these kind of engaged scholarship models that we've been seeing across other language studies. In what ways is translation, or can it be dialogic, right, in terms of community, cultural, as well as linguistic translation processes?
Yeah, thank you for that question. It's a great question. I would say that in one sense, translation that happens in the academy, collaboration, as much as universities say they love interdisciplinarity and collaboration when it comes to your tenure dossier, right? They want, it's the sort of single authorship thing, especially within the humanities, in the natural sciences, for example, but there's a hierarchy there too of like, who's the number one author, who's the number two author, but we tend not to co-author in the humanities. So I think within that institutional structure, it can be more difficult. In terms of outside of the academy, certainly it's a possibility, but translation is so poorly paid that, if you have the collaboration among several translators and the author, let's say, or people from the community, and you're dividing up that piece of the pie, which is so small, how do you also have an equitable labor equitable recognition of labor. So there are translators, for example, Meg Berkobian, who has written about a sort of socialist cooperative of translation and thinking about translation as a sort of collaborative of care. So that's, again, moving outside of capitalist institutions into trying to radically reimagine something different. I think that, in order to get around these, really make space for collaboration in a way that still allows people to sustain a living, then it's right, the institutions that have to change that, reward you with tenure, a job, money for the labor you performed. So, funding of the arts, radical refunding of the arts, rethinking how people are recognized for labor or how the arts reach people is sort of like, this, you can do it, but we're still within these structures. Yeah.
Thank you so much. This has been absolutely fascinating. And as a mark of my extreme interest in this topic, I just wonder if you could share some of those articles or citations or data on white translators toning down, for example, anti-Black racism or other impacts of white supremacist translation practice. I would love to hear them. Thank you.
Yeah, sure. So one piece that I can think of is, I believe the author is Gwenya Hayek, who has written about the translation from Arabic, actually, of anti-Black racism in a text in Arabic, translated into English, which the title is something like The Whitewashing of, I think it's by Hanan El-Sheikh is the author being translated, which also goes to show that anti-Black racism exists across cultures, not only in white supremacist frameworks, but also in this Arab text. Judith Lavoie, who's a French-Canadian scholar, has written about the translation of racialized dialect in Huck Finn into French. And there are Yuping, I'm not going to remember the names. This one is available online. I'm also happy to send a list of resources to Jan that she can distribute about the translation of The Color Purple into Chinese and racialized dialect. And there is a Slovenian scholar, Janko Trupej, I think his name is, who talks about the translation of racialized slurs in, the author's name is so going to escape me, but into Slovenian and German, also German, I think he works on. I have an article in the works also about a translator who, translating a Black author, Dany Laferrière, who is a Haitian author living in Canada, wrote a satire of the way that white culture perceives Black men and sort of plays up all these racial stereotypes. And he uses nègre in French, and David Homel in his introduction says, I'm going to use the N-word at some points when it seems necessary, but mainly use the word Negro. And because that's the kind of outdated way in which white culture is constructing Black men. And then if you count the translations, he actually uses Black more than half the time. And this especially at times when Laferrière is making a distinction between Laferrière uses noir when he's talking about actual Black people, and nègre when he's talking about the perception of Black men by white society. And by flattening it all to Black, the racial critique is erased essentially. So those are some that come to mind off the top of my head.
Check back on the symposium website. We will put out.
Yeah.
there is a lot of change afoot. And, from, and we have some infrastructural absences here. Like we don't have enough journals to advance this discourse, for example, right? But maybe we can also talk a little bit about sort of the more forward-looking things that we are trying to do in translation, and Alta's BIPOC efforts, which you have been also so incredibly, important. Can you maybe talk about that a little bit? Because that's sort of a way of changing the practitioner field, and in fact diversifying the discourse and the practice.
Yeah, so I think, so for example, you have the fellowship here for the MFA program. There's the Janssen Fellowship at Alta, which is for a translator of color. It's a travel fellowship. There's now a new BIPOC, mentorship with Alta. And there's the BIPOC caucus. And I think one advantage of the BIPOC caucus in the American Literary Translators Association is that it's only loosely affiliated with Alta. They have their own budget, they have their own meetings. And so they're sort of not beholden to the institutional structures of Alta. We support them as we can, advertise the meetings, give them Zoom space for meetings. But in that sense, it kind of is self-organizing, escaping the sort of things that Alta has to do because it's a nonprofit with a certain status and has lawyers and these kinds of things. So I think the BIPOC caucus enables that diversification in a way that I think will then bleed into the organization as a whole. And I think in terms of journals, and I think some of the most interesting work of anti-racism and translation is happening on places like Twitter. Right. And I think that's because it's a space that isn't gate kept, right? Anyone can have a Twitter account. And I mean, certainly there is different kind of social media prestige of like who gets followers. And but I think there are a lot of translators of color like Anton Hur or Jeremy Tang or Yilin Wang who are very vocal about calling out white supremacy in translation that just didn't happen before. And I think the way that they phrase, especially Anton, the way that he phrases visibility is maybe different than Benuti's ideas about the translator's visibility. He's like, I'm so invisible unless I'm shouting, you won't see me. So he's like, his Twitter account is like kind of him shouting all the time. But I think, it's important that that's a space that isn't gate kept. It's not space that is given, it's space that's taken. And so I think, part of my work, I'm inside the academy, and unfortunately, a lot of knowledge is legitimated by the academy. So part of the work that I see my book doing is for, translators of color to be able to point to this book and say, see, there's this, empirical peer-reviewed study that has been accepted. Not that they don't need it for themselves, but larger discussions kind of demand this legitimation in this way. Other question? We started early, so we have extra time now. Oh, yeah. Yes, I was checking. I thought, oh, who's writing to me? It was you. As my professor, I had a professor at college who always used to say, "Have I blown you away with my amazing that you're speechless?" I mean, in a self-deprecating way. I don't think I've blown you away, but as a way to say, please, with your questions.
And I don't mean to put you on the spot, but what do you do in the classroom with all of this? How do you diversify pedagogy, and how do you bring this into the sort of the discourse inside the classroom?
Yeah, it's a great question. So one of the, I recently taught a grad workshop in translation, very much like I was. We usually start off with some intralingual translation exercises or interlingual. We did a unit, for example, on exophonic translation. I think 4 of 9 of my translators were exophonic translators and translators of color. So from Saudi Arabia, Turkey, and China. And I did an exercise where the translators who are normally translating exophonically, that is out of their first language, translated into their first language. And the translators who normally translated the right word into English had to translate into the languages they translated into, which they were not used to. And then they had to reflect on that, process. I also did an exercise where I gave them an excerpt of Rider Haggard, who was a colonial adventure writer. And it was a very racist description of a Black man. And I asked them to translate it however they wanted. They could do whatever they wanted to it in such a way that they weren't changing what you couldn't just like make something happen that didn't. You couldn't have the Black man like punch Alan Quartermain in the face, right? But you had to translate in such a way that you were calling attention to the racism of the text. So they had a lot of trouble with that, to think about like, what do I do with the text with the racism is baked into it? Won't be surprised that Trish Hartland did the best one where it was, she just left the text as it was. And then in red is the palimpsest. She did the sort of subtext going on. And the scene is one where the hero, Alan Quartermain, is looking at this Black man and sort of saying like, oh, he's a noble Black man out of all the other ones, and etc. And she translated it as this homoerotic, racialized discourse with this palimpsest over the top that shows the way that like race and sexuality and masculinity are all tied up in this text. Yeah, I think those are some things just to, right? That's the question. Like when you're faced with racism, what do you do with it? I don't think you can get rid of it. For me, that's whitewashing, right? It's sort of giving a pass to someone who is racist. Yeah, I think this is the question. Yeah.
Just be having the whole conversation, but I guess continuing that question, I did have a question about like the students that come to your class who may not be familiar with whiteness as opposed to white people. And I was wondering how you deal with that and how you deal with the conversations about distinguishing between those things, and then your role in like stating your positionality and when you're doing the work, basically.
Yeah, thank you. I have another class, Race, Gender, Sexuality in Translation. That's a graduate seminar. I found that students, I thought they would want to be like, oh, I've already read like feminist theory and some critical race theory, and now I just want to like read translation theory about these things. But they said, I don't really have that background. So I was like, let's read some French feminism and then read like the Quebecois translators. For when we got to the part about race, they said, everyone uses this word intersectionality. I don't actually know what it means. So we read Kimberly Crenshaw. And in a few weeks, you can't, I think, do a crash course in critical race theory, but sort of turning towards scholars of color who have established these concepts in order to have that baseline of being able to talk about how whiteness is figured structurally. I also think that it's really interesting that when I first started working on race and translation to now, I think that students have become more savvy and more willing to talk about race, even if I think they think that there are right ways and wrong ways to do it, and they can be a bit worried sometimes. I am pleasantly surprised, at least, at what's coming out. Not to say that there aren't all those emails about racist incidents on campus. Even in my very blue state of Massachusetts, right? Maybe even worse in my very blue state of Massachusetts. Trying to think if there are other examples. Yeah, I think that main question is that the students have an anxiety about, some translators I think are like, I can translate anything. I'm amplifying a marginalized voice, and sort of walk in with their elbows, knocking stuff over. There's a really infamous case in Haitian translation about, so another example, a white Haitian translator has a blog, which is a series of interviews with translators, and he interviewed another white translator who is not a specialist in Haiti, is just a specialist in French, and was commissioned to do a Haitian work. And in the interview, she says, I didn't know anything about Haitian culture or Haitian literature, or any of the references, but this editor asked me to do it, so I did. Not thinking like, maybe not the right person. So the white translator who runs the series said, well, he sort of done the work, if we want to use that term. He said, well, you use the word voodoo instead of the word vaudou, which is preferred in English. Could you talk about that decision? And not picking up on, this is a major problem. She said, it sounded Baudelarian to say voodoo princess. I like the way it sounded. So this is the sort of like frames of whiteness, the sort of knocking over the elbows. I think that most of my students aren't that kind of translator, but they haven't kind of moved beyond the, I'm a white translator, like they're, I think, so careful that they're not doing the work in a different way. That makes sense. Like, how do I think about my positionality? This, as I mentioned, not an excuse, but a sort of call to do things differently. And it's something, right, that I am a white translator who translates primarily women of color. So it's something, that I think about a lot. One of the things I appreciated most in my sort of education in racial justice was a reading I saw it and I never got the name of the author. So if anyone has the reference, it was a Black faculty member asking her white colleagues to make mistakes, sort of take the risk to make mistakes, because at least that means you're trying to do the work. Not to make mistakes like the white translator being like, I could translate whatever, I don't have to do the work. But, you will make mistakes in doing the work. And so it's better to make mistakes doing the work than to make mistakes not doing the work. Does that make sense?
All right. So because this will be easier for me to share with the group now, if you were interested in the information we said we're going to put online, if you go to the website and then under the schedule of events for this lecture, I'll add it as a new link. So that way you all know where to look when you go to find it. And so thank you again for that incredible lecture.
Hello, I'm Aron Aji. I'm the director of the translation programs in the Division of World Languages, Literatures, and Cultures. And we're delighted to participate in this important symposium. I want to say a few words about the significance of this symposium. This is a symposium about exophonic translation. It's a fancy way of saying people who translate into their second language from their native language. Part of this is because of what we are experiencing in the field right now with the decrease in funding and support for language training in the Anglophone world, the Anglo-American world. It's been really the responsibility of native speakers to introduce their own literatures into English. So there is in fact a resurgence of bilingual translators or exophonic translators right now functioning with us. Well, I'm saying with us, but I'm one of them, functioning with them. But there is another interesting thing here that is not sufficiently appreciated, and that is Iowa is especially an important place for exophonic translation. One of our founders was Gayatri Spivak. So in other words, this program began, in fact, with an accented translator, if you will. And right now, all 5 of us who are teaching regularly in translation are hyphenated individuals. And for most of us, we are in fact translating into our literary language from our native languages. So there is one of them, Natasha. So we are really delighted that without really much doing on our part, we also have been welcoming, not this child apparently, but we also have been welcoming an increasing number of international students into our program. In fact, right now, we have almost half of our students who are from overseas, who are participating in our program. And so it creates this incredible environment where exophonic translation is front and center, if you will. And our multilingual translation pedagogy that has been developed on this campus for the past 60 years is especially conducive to hosting that many different languages in our midst. In fact, right now, there are about 16 languages that our students translate from into English. So without further ado, not adieu, but ado, I just want to introduce them to you, and then I will turn the microphones over to them. We have here, first we'll begin this way and go that way, I suppose. Our moderators are Anna McGovern and Khaled Rashid. Anna translates from French to English with great interest in Haitian literature. Khaled translates from Arabic to English. And Mirgul Kali Sherwood is from Kazakhstan, translating from Kazakh into English. Ara Javerian is brand new in our midst and already befitting her last name, has been a Javher for us. She's really a gem. She comes to us from Iran and translates from Farsi, but also she has been an accomplished translator from English to Farsi or Persian or Farsi for the past 10 years. So she's really phenomenal. Reed Dempsey is a double degree student in our program, doing a PhD in English and also the MFA in literary translation, translating from German, but translating, in fact, hyphenated writers himself. And Vala Torotsdotter is, did I say that right? Not bad, no? Vala Torotsdotter is from Iceland and translating from Icelandic, and just recently had her translation released into the world, which we are very excited about. So I'll turn it over to you all. Thank you.
Great. All right. Thank you so much, Aron. Thank you all for being here. So thrilled to have this group of accomplished translators here today. So I'd like to start by asking you all to tell us a little more about your translation work and the languages that you work with. Maybe what was your path to translating these languages and to translating into English? Is there anything else you can tell us about the context in which you understand your work? Would anyone like to start?
I guess I can start. So I'm originally from Kazakhstan, and my native language is Kazakh. But because Kazakhstan used to be a part of the Soviet Union, and Russian was the lingua franca of the Soviet Union, I ended up going to Russian school. I'm also from a region that is seen as a stronghold of traditional culture, which means that an overwhelming majority of population there speaks Kazakh. And even if they attend Russian schools, it remains their main language. But it so happened that I became obsessed with Russian language and literature, and I effectively became a Russian speaker almost exclusively. So that's my relationship with Russian, which I'll return later. And then after college, I worked for a small local company that didn't pay me a salary for a year. So I basically worked free for a year, and I was desperate. I didn't like it. And I heard that nearby oil field is hiring people who know English. So I learned English, and that's how my journey in English started. Then I moved to the States, and now English is my main spoken language. And so when I began, I decided to translate literature in several years ago. There was a question of which languages to translate from and into. Russian was my strongest language, then was English, and Kazakh was the language that I knew the least. And the natural direction for me would have been from English to Russian. But I chose a completely different one, a difficult one, from Kazakh into English. So basically from one language that I didn't know very well into another that I probably knew a little better. So, and the reasons, I guess, I thought of English as the language of my present and future, the language that I speak, think, read, and write on. And I wanted to invest in it. And Kazakh, my speaking Russian as a child created alienation with my own language and culture, even my own family. So for me, translating from Kazakh is a way to reconnect with my own language.
I was born in Western Iran in a province called Kurdistan. So I grew up in a bilingual Kurdish Farsi community. And in my country, learning a third language, or for some people, the second language, which is mostly English, is very important to the families because they don't want their children to be very isolated from the world as they should be. So my father was one of those people who insisted that we learn another language. We should learn the English. And so I started learning English when I was 13. And then I sort of fall in love with this language. And I thought that whatever I want to do when I grow up, it has to be something that has to do with English and definitely with literature. So that's why I chose my undergrad major in English literature. And that's how my journey to translation began. So we had a few courses in literary translation in our undergrad. And I got some positive feedbacks from my professors. And then that's how I started working. And I made that my whole profession, working as a translator, to translate the world literature into my own language for my people. And then like almost 2 years ago, I started thinking like, there is something that I have to do more. there is something that I should be doing, and that is introducing the literature of my country to people of the world, because that is a field that is not known. Not many people know about us, know about our literature. And that's why I decided to continue this journey in another way around, that is to translate from Farsi to English. And that is how I joined this program. And this is mostly a new thing for me, because I am used to doing it from English, and now I'm doing it into English. So that's like learning the language again from a new perspective this time, in a way that I can be a good writer, not just a good reader. So yeah, that's how I got here, and that is my relationship with this language.
Yeah, so I was born in Iceland, in Reykjavik, and my parents are Icelandic. My whole family's Icelandic, but we moved to the States when I was 7 because my parents did their graduate work in the US. For a long time, you actually just couldn't get a PhD in Iceland, so everyone always went abroad to get their do their doctoral work, and then inevitably came back. Long story short, I didn't really come back, not in a straightforward way. So I have a kind of confused identity, because basically at age 7, I pretty much my whole life transitioned into English from exclusively speaking Icelandic. And I remember, when we moved to the US, I actually didn't speak a word of English. And according to my parents, I learned it in one summer, and then started correcting their English. And so, yeah, I basically spent half of my childhood, part of my young adult life in the US and studying in the US, but always wanted to go back to Iceland. So I ended up going back in my 20s. But I hadn't actually ever been in school in Iceland. I went to what we call 6-year-old grade. I guess it would be like first grade or something. But I had sort of missed out on an Icelandic education. So I wanted to do, I finished my BA in Iceland. And I sort of fell into publishing by accident. I was interested in poetry, and I fell in with some people who were starting a sort of zine for a series of poetry pamphlets and chapbooks. And this was just sort of a social thing. I was also interested in poetry, but this sort of snowballed and became very popular, and a way for emerging writers to get published, have mentorships with established authors, and be edited and have their work published. So long story short, I was in Iceland working as a publisher for about 10 years, which is sort of strange because I always felt like English was my stronger language. And because of my work in publishing, I just became intimately acquainted with a lot of interesting Icelandic authors. And I had been doing translation almost all of my adult life, but for like museums, translating catalog, copy, the kind of translation you get paid for. And I actually just hadn't considered literary translation at all. But in 2016, actually, I moved to the UK after I met my husband, and this was like 2 months before Brexit. And I just started to feel like I wanted to bring some of these amazing writers that I knew from Iceland to a British or an English-speaking audience. So I asked one of the authors I happened to know if she'd let me translate her work, and I spent a year translating her poetry, and that was published as a selected poems in the UK with a press called Carcanet, and that sort of set me off on my literary translation path. But as I say, like I'm not quite sure what my native language is anymore, and maybe we'll talk a little bit more about this. I have some issues with that term, but yeah, I was really just delighted actually to find the program at Iowa because I was interested in literary translation. I also, I was just doing it with no context. And in Iceland, you can't study literary translation as an art. You can study it. You can study it as something that you're going to do yeah, in a different context. So I was delighted to see somewhere talking about literary translation as an art form, and that's how I ended up here.
Sorry, excuse me. Hi. So my relationship to my language I translate from is German. I have, as Aaron said, I'm interested in hyphenated writers because I have like a deeply personal, impersonal relationship with language that I translate from. I began, my interest in literature began in language and kind of still continues in that vein. So I studied linguistics. And translation is always present in linguistics, even in formal linguistics. And while at the University of Arizona, I was working with David Gramling, who's an applied linguist, who brought the literary translation MFA at Iowa to my attention. And I'm very grateful for that. It became quite a gift. When I came to Iowa to study literature and to study English, I had kind of a profound grief experience. And I found a kind of harbor in a foreign language that I didn't know that I needed. And there were some things I was able to explore and some kind of relationships I was able to have to things happening in my life in a language that was not my own and that didn't, by all accounts, belong to me. So I started to cultivate an interest in writers who are similarly working something out in their second language, their third language, their fourth language. And so Sasha Stanisic is one of the writers that I work with. His collection of short stories has been the work I've been doing at Iowa. So I am actually the opposite of the of the target of this panel, being primarily an endophonic translator.
Yeah, we'd like to thank Reed for serving the function of the other on this panel. When we were sitting around trying to figure out a term for what Reed would be, we thought endophonic. The term does not exist. But as Vala showed us, there's really a problem with the word exophonic. First of all, there is no opposite to it. So by being exophonic, it's almost like they had to create a category for you because you are diverging from the norm. But Vala mentioned that she's almost entirely bilingual. English feels like her first language for all purposes. So we thought we can hear from you about whether you think exophonic is a useful category. Can it offer us a useful way to understand translation? Or should we abandon it altogether? Why or why not?
So I once wrote a paper on endophonic translation, but I did not know the term. So every time I had to use it, I would write translator working from the first mother native language into the second, third, and language. It really helped with the page count requirement for my paper, but it was very tedious. So I think practically, I like this term because it's simple. But I also wonder what exactly this word means. If exo is outside, outer, or going outward, and phone is voice, I'm wondering where this voice is located, because it's ambiguous. It seems ambiguous. Is this voice, which is presumably a mother language, is permanently outside, like in the word exoskeleton, or is it inside and it's moving outwards, like in exogamous? And I have to say that in a sense, I like this uncertainty and ambiguity, because that's, as we learned from our introductions, our relationships with our languages are not simple and straightforward. They are complicated and they're always changing. Like for me, English language now became my language. So am I really an exophonic translator? I am translating into my own language. So that's anyone else?
Yeah, just to add to that. I wonder about the word exophonic in the same way I wonder about phrases like mother tongue or native language. Just in the sense of like, what are we looking for when we use that term? Like what assumptions and expectations are we bringing to the table when we use words like that? And I think both Khaled and Midgul gestured towards this, that there's a kind of othering happening, right? There's an assumed center and an assumed right way, or at least popular received way of doing translation. And I feel like exophonic translators probably wouldn't have come up with the term exophonic translator, right? Like it never occurred to me that I needed such a term. But it's also interesting just to think about where this word comes up. Like, for example, mother tongue or native language. The only time I really come across these words in my life are when I'm being asked to prove something. So the University of Iowa asks me this question when they are checking whether I'm allowed to teach students. The Icelandic Literature Center asks me this question when they're deciding whether I should be allowed to translate something and I should get a grant. So it's really interesting, the kind of gatekeeping nature of these words, and just to think about like, what purpose do they serve? Why do we need them? And then most importantly, maybe like what expectations and assumptions are we bringing to the table when we use them?
Yeah, this is something we had a few preliminary discussions before appearing today, and this was something we were talking about a lot, is the context in which these terms are being applied and where this translator is placed. So not only the nation that you're in, the sort of boundary that you're translating across, but in what way are you being evaluated and by whom are you being evaluated as an exophonic or an endophonic translator? So is it someone who's determining who gets a grant? Is it someone who's determining who gets to teach the literature of one tradition or another? Or is it translators who are hoping to advocate for their own visibility in the translatosphere by saying we actually are valid translators of this or that language? So there's a lot of calculation that we had to do, I think, and we still haven't settled kind of that of like the usefulness of that term.
The first time I heard this word was like a few weeks ago when I was invited to this panel. I honestly had no idea that this term even existed.
We came to Ara and informed her that she was an exophone, and she was surprised to find out.
They informed me that I actually have a label that I didn't know about. So, but it was very interesting to me when I started to think about it, that, okay, we are actually differentiating between translators who are translating into their mother tongue or not. So we also had some discussions in our issues class about this. And then when I thought about it, I was like, okay, so I am a person with a certain amount of ability in translating. And then in two different geographical spots, I have two different labels. Back home, I am obviously an endophonic translator. Here, I'm an exophonic translator. And I kept thinking that, in my opinion, translation is not just writing something. It's, first of all, it's understanding the text and then writing it. So if I can be a good translator when I'm translating into my mother tongue, I should be probably qualified to do it the other way, because the first thing that you do is to understand the text. So if I'm not a good reader in English or not a good reader in Farsi, so I cannot be a good writer in either of them. So the thing that I kept thinking about when I heard this term was like, how can this be different? How can I be a different translator when I'm translating one way or the other one? And the exact same day, I went home and started an entry in my translation diary, and I said that, okay, so does that mean I was treated differently back home as a translator, and I am treated in another way here? These are like questions that in all of our sessions that we had together and all the things that we talk about, we could not exactly come to a solid conclusion that why exactly do we need these terms and how they can actually help us. Maybe we can find out today.
We will find out today and record a definitive answer to that question. So you're all raising these really interesting points about how these terms sometimes come up in a context of gatekeeping. Maybe they bring certain assumptions to the table. And I'd love to hear more from all of you about what are some of the, like in the course of your translation work, have you encountered some different attitudes toward exophonic translation? Have you felt like there are different assumptions or expectations being brought? Are there like experiences that you have personally had or that you've seen others have with this?
This is also a chance for me and everyone to plug Exchanges. So this is a place where we can start this conversation. Exchanges is the Journal of Literary Translation at the University of Iowa. A number of us in this room have served as editors in various capacities for this journal. And last year, when I was most involved with it, I would sometimes receive submissions from translators, especially in South Asia, Southwest Asia, where there was always sort of in their translator's note this paragraph in which they would apologize more or less for translating into a language that is their second language, or for the complexity of their situation vis-a-vis their languages. And that is a really interesting impulse. And I think this question is directed at that. Why are there translators who feel that they have to begin their work for like submission for consideration for publication in the United States? They have to begin with this statement of who they are and what they're doing and why they're doing. So that anxiety about this is something that I have noticed appear in an irregular fashion from or in the submissions to Exchanges.
Just to add to that, I think that's really interesting. Partly because it didn't occur to me that I ever would have to explain why I had the right to translate into English, which for me is my stronger language. And so the first time I was asked to do so by the Icelandic Literature Center, which is a center in Iceland that gives a lot of grants. Iceland is obviously a very small country, and probably per capita we have, I imagine, like way more translation out of Iceland than we should, given our size. But we're very keen to sell ourselves abroad and to bring our culture to the world. So we put a lot of money into translation. And the first time I was ever asked to explain myself regarding my languages was by them, when they wouldn't give me a translation grant because they had a rule that you had to be translating into your native language. And I ended up getting around this by getting a British editor who had some kind of, he had an OBE, so he's been honored by the Queen. The Queen has said that this man knows what good literature is, and I had him write me a letter that says that I speak English well and write English well enough to translate into English. And so every time I apply for a grant, I upload this PDF just in case. But I was sort of shocked, actually. It didn't occur to me that I would have to explain. And it's very interesting that this is one of the places where I would have to do so, but it also shows a certain emphasis where it matters more to them, let's say. They're not asking for credentials about anyone's Icelandic knowledge, let's put it that way, right? So it matters more to them that whatever is produced is going to sound good in English, and it doesn't maybe matter as much to them about the language ability of the translator, which I think just speaks volumes.
As for being treated differently, when I wanted to apply here, or when we want to apply anywhere, we have to submit language proficiency certificates. We have to show using an international examination that how much we know about English. So this is something very routine for us because English is not a language that is being spoken in my country. We don't have institutions that they teach merely in English. So that part was routine for us. But then there was a second evaluation that happened here when I came, because that test was not exactly approved by the university, and they said you should take another test. But as a translator, I haven't been around much to see if I am treated differently as an exophonic translator. But I feel like I am treating the others differently because there is something that caught my attention in our translation workshops, and that was whenever we are reading a piece by one of my classmates who is a native, I'm always hesitant in making suggestions and edits because when it comes to a native person, I think like they may not make this mistake. They are native. So if you do not understand this, something is wrong with your own English. But I know for a fact that doesn't matter if you are native in the language or not, you can make mistakes in your translation. You can make mistakes with your grammar. You can have typos and everything. But again, this is something that I faced here as an exophonic translator, that I think that I am not confident enough to comment on pieces that are written by my native classmates. So I think for now, I am the one who is treating the others differently. I don't know if I am going to be treated differently in future when I am around more.
So I guess I've been pretty lucky in that I was welcomed by people in the translation community and helped along the way. But it was also the translation community where I also realized that I may be an outsider. At my first Alta conference, a couple of translators approached me, Russian translators, and they offered collaboration. And at the time, I was just beginning. I had no publications. I was completely unknown, and I was flattered. But I also was a little confused about how this collaboration would work because these people didn't know my language. And when I later asked how the collaboration would work, the person said that each of us would be the experts for our own languages. So there's an assumption, I think, that I was only an expert of my own language, Kazakh, but I was not expert in English. And as much, I really love creating the first draft translation, looking up words, building sentences. I really love that part. But even more, I love building the English text. That's what I live for in reality. And I felt that it would be taken away from me, or in such a collaboration, I would produce the English text to the best of my ability, and then the rest would be editing. And when I suggested that to that person, they said, no, it's not editing. It's more than that. So that was interesting to me in terms of where do these assumptions come from? And do other people, emerging translators, encounter such instances? So that was my.
It seems the assumption of exophonic translators is that they are working from a language they know well, they know better than the language that they are translating into. And so that might create some barrier when you have to keep proving that you know English. And it also comes with the assumption that what you are going to produce will not read like fluent English, will not read like good literature. And so you require an editing process to get past it. But that also raises the question of, is unfluent or something that does not read like literature considered a bad translation? Is the foreignness of this bad translation rooted in a deeper understanding of the source text, of the original language? What is a bad translation. I know Mirgul, you have something to say about this.
Yeah, I don't know. So I was interested to see how much this phrase bad translation appears in translation studies texts and essays on translation. Every author has to mention it. It's as if without bad translations, there's no translation studies. But I thought I will look a little bit more closely into what exactly bad translation is. I think there are many different kinds of them, but the two main issues people find is loyalty to the original text, and then the readability of the final text, of the target text. And when you look even more closely into this, the first one is usually the accusations are made against endophonic translators because they supposedly know the source language less than their native language, I think. And then it's usually the translations that are published, and enough time has passed for people to read it, compare with the original, and express their opinions. And opinions are made by, it's important who makes these opinions too. Readers, critics, academics. And so these opinions also have an ability to promote this book even further, even if it's a bad translation, and make it popular. With the second instance, bad translations that have flawed language. I have seen a book like that. I wouldn't call it flawed language. It's non-standard language, maybe, not smooth English language. There are books like that, but there are not many, which means that these bad translations are not published. And the people who make judgment of these translations as bad, these editors and publishers. In other words, gatekeepers. And on the other side of the gate are many translators, among whom are exophonic translators, I think. And in thinking of these two things, I think we could relax some of the rules, some of what we see as of our aversion to infidelity or difficult language. I think if we relax the standards, more international literature, especially from underrepresented languages, could come in.
This is also interesting given the sanction space for quote unquote bad translation. There have been a number of publications recently interested in experimental translations or fungal translations or whatever it is. So it's like there is a circumscribed space where it's okay to do things that would not be so easy to move through kind of the translatosphere otherwise. So it's like in these carnival periods, anything can go in this specific issue of, whatever magazine it's going to be. At the same time, there are translators who really struggle to get their pieces to reach that kind of quotidian smoothness that's necessary. So we've had translators in the past in our program who had to wait for a special issue around particular topics or particular languages in order for them to be able to submit, because the writers that they worked with or the topics that they were translating were kind of soft zones of we're not going to admit or accept this in. So the relative smoothness and the ease with which a piece moves around and will be published is a big contributing factor. So yeah, it's interesting that thing is being celebrated in many areas of translation studies and contemporary publishing, but it's also such a big concern and worry for translators, especially when your writer is someone who has a conflicted relationship with language.
I'm interested in dodging this question and talking about something tangential to it. I I was thinking what you were saying, Mirgul, about like endophonic translators getting critiqued for not knowing the source language well enough and that being a kind of bad translation. And I was thinking, when I was thinking about exophonic, endophonic, I was very keen to interrogate this binary and wanting to imagine it more like a spectrum, because I think we could probably all agree that either end of the spectrum is bad and would result in a bad translation, right? Like, without wanting to be too prescriptive, I think we all agree that like the text has to be readable, like, and maybe we can like play around with how smooth and how readable it has to be, but it has to sort of make sense in English, right? And it has to sort of stand alone as a piece of literature in English. At the same time, we also have some vague sense of fidelity, and we feel like if something, and like I know this is complicated by the idea of version and like people wanting to call things that are maybe deviating from the text a little bit more translations as well, but maybe let's say in general we do have a sense that fidelity is important to translation. And so either extreme, let's say the endophonic translator who just doesn't know the language and they just feel like they can do it, versus the exophonic translator who just doesn't speak English very well. Like either one obviously is not going to result in a very good translation. But like we tend to assume that it's either or, right? But for me, and the reason that I think the idea of a native language starts to sort of crumble, particularly in the context of translation and with translators, is that I think a lot of translators end up just sort of being somewhere in the middle of this, where even, like Reed, you would maybe say, and it's easier for you to say your native language is English, but at the same time, because of your training, that definition starts to break down, and like you're ultimately striving to make German a kind of native language for yourself as well. So yeah, I was just like thinking about like why we have to think about it as a binary, and like obviously in both directions it seems bad. But for translators, I think they tend to be just moving towards the middle, where both languages are going to be a kind of native language for them in the end.
When Khaled was coming up with this question, I told him that asking what is a bad translation is a bad question. You didn't do that. We don't do that. I personally believe that we cannot universally label a translation as a good one or a bad one, because it's completely up to where and with whom you put that translation, who is talking about it, and in what circumstance that translation is being talked about. Because if a translation is very famously bad for so many reasons, there's always someone that's gonna say this is a very good one. And on the other side, that's the same thing. When someone says, okay, yeah, this translation is very good, definitely there are so many people that can talk about it and say, no, this is bad. So it comes to a very personal choice, although there are so many rules, so many ethics that has to be present in a translation, that everyone agrees that these are like the norms that should be observed in a translation and how you do it. But then again, to put such a harsh label on a translation, I think that's something not very practical.
I think we also shouldn't overdetermine the agency of a translator, like as if the translator gets the final call in all situations, which I don't think is the experience of anybody in this room. It would be nice if that were the case, because sometimes like the translator is not the one who created the quote unquote bad translation. There are other forces, like other structures that might encourage a translator to do something that deviates quite noticeably from the original. But like the impetus towards that isn't always this matter of proficiency, which like Vala points out is connected to certain aspects of our lives, but not all.
So throughout this discussion, we've been calling the category of exophonic translation into question. You all have highlighted the complexity of each translator's relationship to the languages they work with. And we've talked about the norms and assumptions that this term exophonic carries. So my last question to you all, and then I'd love to take questions from anybody who wants to as well, is what uses do you see for the category of exophonic translation, like going forward? Can this be leveraged to maybe call us to break down certain binaries and barriers in some way? Is there like a use for this term for advocacy that we can be doing? What other like changes would you like to see going forward to the way that we think about exophonic translation?
I guess, like I mentioned earlier, I personally don't see the use, myself using it. I won't be introducing myself. Hello, I'm an exophonic translator, or write it in my bio. It seems weird, but I think it's really useful for in academia to look into this phenomenon and term and how it affects people and translation industry itself.
I think especially if it's helping us to point out ways in which certain translators are being discriminated against by structures that control who gets published and who gets grants and who gets residencies, and like all the things that really control what work by what kind of writer gets published where. Then I think it's very helpful if it's helping us to critique the structures that are keeping us from hearing more voices or hearing certain voices. But I think that sword definitely cuts both ways, and you don't want it to fall into a more simplistic and reductive kind of like cudgel to beat translators when you feel like they aren't as proficient as you might need or want them to be.
Just to add quickly, I think it might also be a way of celebrating the fact that I do think there are a lot more exophonic, or it seems that way, that there are more exophonic translators, and it might be useful to think about how the field of literary translation is changing as a result.
As Miguel just said, this term can be very useful in an academic setting when we want to talk about different ways of doing the translation. A minute that this term exophonic translator becomes something close to racism, like these people should not get funding, these people should not be published, these people should be always questioned and critiqued. That is when this term can actually turn into something destructive instead of something that can be actually helping the matter to develop. So if we use this to introduce the fact that there are so many people in the world that are doing, that are writing in a language that is not their native, that is not something that they started to talk when they were growing up, talking about it and having this distinction can help in an academic setting when we want to scientifically talk about translation. But if it's going to become a barrier for these people to become successful translators and have publishings, then that is when the problem actually arises.
Are there any questions from the audience for the panelists?
Thank you. That was a really there's so many insightful points for me to sit with, especially as I teach exophonic graduate students. I'm thinking of Anton Her, the Korean translator, who once got a review that said this translation is too fluent. And him, interpreting that as like, who is this uppity Asian, was like how he put it, who does he think he is? And that, it sounds like it was translated from French or Italian and not Korean, as a French and Italian should read fluently and Korean not. But I was thinking about this sort of double bind of having to prove your fluency, but then the fluency being wrong also, but maybe your own political position of, being always having to prove yourself, but yet that you can speak or write a standard literary English, but maybe not being interested in a standard. So that, double bind of where do you see the exophonic translator in having to fill those norms and wanting to push against those norms, and how do you see yourself in that relationship?
I feel like we sort of gestured very briefly earlier towards this idea that an exophonic translator might be seeing something in the text and maybe trying to bring it into the text because they're so close to the source language. And I wonder, and like maybe I'm just answering your question with another question, just thinking about, like whether exophonic translators are more tempted to try and bring through stranger characteristics from their source language into their translations. I think probably almost in every case, you're going to get a lot of pushback from your editor with that. Personally, I like to do that. I see certain things happening in Icelandic that I would like to bring through, and I recognize that it's going to be a little bit painful for English. And I try to do that, and I feel like it's convincing and that it's not like too like so foreignizing that I'm just alienating the reader. But I would say like that editors tend to just hate it. They just don't want to go for it, and they don't understand it. And I think the interpretation is somehow that something has gone wrong rather than imagining that something's being done on purpose, trying to do something with it.
So my development as a translator is from smoothing everything to please the mythical English reader, as Corine mentioned. And I am more increasingly going toward disrupting translation with my texts. And I even envision in the future doing completely anarchical text where everything is destabilized or deconstructed. But right now, I think I am trying to adopt Kazakh syntax. Well, I learned it from Aron, thanks to Aron. I embraced Kazakh syntax, which when translated into English is very, it looks like English, but it makes editors very uncomfortable. They say you can start the sentence with, what are they called? Introductory, I don't know the grammatical terms. So the unusual sentences. And I try to put as many Kazakh, transliterated Kazakh words into text as I can, even if I'm not glossing them. And I'm moving also towards not glossing, just leaving them unknown. And I actually, the more I do it, it's more fun for me. Before it was scary, but now I feel like I'm being mischievous and it's fun.
When I try to translate something from my own language into English, there's definitely something that I want to bring into the language, something that I want to introduce to the new culture. Because bringing a literature of a place to another and then like copying and pasting it into the exact distant target language, that's just like not introducing new things. So this is something that I do, and I'm a little experimenting with it in our workshops, is to bring as much as I can from that culture into this, because the whole point of literature, international literature, is for people to like travel while they are reading the book, to sort of learn a few things that they didn't know about it. But at the end of the day, that's going to be like a very probably painful discussion with the editors and the publishers. But I think there is always can be like a sort of negotiation that you can do with them, and just introduce what you want to do and what is the goal of your doing, so they can finally respect that little of foreignizing that you're doing in the translation. So I think that's just a matter of explaining your reasons for doing it, to make them like to understand it better and let you do it.
Idioms are an interesting place to talk about this. So this shows up a lot in translations, both in workshop and that are submitted to exchanges, where one of the places where English language editors and publishers are more willing to let things come in is in places like idiomatic expressions. But it's also one of the places where translators are most eager to kind of cover their tracks. And this is something we always have to bring up with submissions in the magazine and in workshop. Of like, why have you taken this like amazing, there's one anecdote I can think of from Polish where like a really treacherous character is described as he would grind his own mother into sausage. And that was replaced with like something very anodyne and like normal in English. So like which everybody reacted really strongly to that. So there are certain like places in a text where that kind of that sheen of translation is allowed and even desired. If you start doing it in other places, like Miracle suggested, then that text becomes experimental in English. And we also have to think about these categories that exist to receive these texts. Like, are you actually now performing a genre transformation as well? And that's, I guess, part of the calculus that a translator has to do. But it's a shame when you want to like stress and play with it. In my own translation practice, like the writers that I work with in German incorporate a lot of English into their texts and are also commenting on the influence of English on German. And so when I do something really crazy, like in workshop, people would say like, don't shoot the messenger. Like that's literally what he has in the page. Like it wasn't me. And having to do that all the time is really exhausting. So I think it's also important to have editors who are willing to go there with you and do it.
Other questions?
Thanks. A great topic and a great panel. I have two notes to make. But I guess both are comments as much as they are questions. First one has to do with this question of exo versus endo, and it was prompted by something one of you said on the panel. I will not be pointing any fingers because why? I'm wondering if the test case for this exo versus endo problem is not one where you can ask yourself, at what point do I use the first person plural when I speak? We. That is, what community do you feel yourself to belong to when you are translating from or into? So in other words, this is an easy shifter test, right? And in that sense, shifters are always mobile and dynamic and no need to point to anything. But to me, that's always, and this is an old conversation around it I've had for about, 15 years now? About, what the we is at the moment of translation. And the second thing has to do with the more recent turn about innovation, neologism, fluency, colloquialisms, etc. A really great test for this, I think, is when you look at books that are published outside of especially the American English realm. So, Anglophone in the sense of both American and UK tests. I use a book published in Hong Kong, translated by a Chinese, bilingual Hong Konger into English. And you crack it open and you think, this is a realm of possibilities. I actually sometimes use it in workshop when I've got nothing else to do. Maybe I'll do it again this year. And say, edit, what would you do with this a text like this? And because I think that right there, Commonwealth allows you that sense of the cliche of English is, and expands further. And in some ways, if that could be taken as a model or as a parameter in which translation is lodged, some of these problems would really be lessened or, so all it takes is just to get the international copyright rules modified so that your translations are automatically published in Malaysia and the problems are gone, right? So, yeah, thank you.
Yeah, go. So
Do we go to Arona or were there?
Yeah,
Battle of panels.
Well, when we translate, I was one of these early exophonic translators who didn't know that I was an exophonic translator. And people asked me if I had a collaborator who was willing to remain unnamed. And I was really offended. And then, in fact, later on, there was a book that came out that had two different sections, one section translated by someone and the other by me. And we didn't know how to promote both names in the cover, so it became translated by Arunaji and Fred Stark. And, then people said, so you do have a collaborator with an Anglo name, Fred Stark, right? Now, the problem here is really about, again, another form of gatekeeping, right? I mean, who is preserving the purity of language, and do we go to Malaysia so that we can speak our version of English? But what I would like to ask you is whether you also deliberately and intentionally think of bending English, breaking it while doing it, because, that's finally where I have come. I mean, I translate into Turkish English. I mean, we have to hyphenate English. We have to really sort of co-opt it to make it more capacious for all these different voices and stories to be heard. In that regard, in fact, it's not very different from the race discourse that we have to also acknowledge. What are your thoughts on this? I mean, because, I was so tired of this apologetic posture that I had to carry. I was expected to carry, because I would always be introduced as he translates from his native language, Well, I just thought, I'm doing something to English, and that's really important. Have you thought about that?
I guess I have just a short comment about that. I think we've all been sort of saying that we do want to do that. I think we also have felt like it's not very popular and maybe very difficult for an emerging translator to do. When preparing for this panel, I was thinking about, like, as I was saying before, like, what does it reveal that we have to use a word like exophone, and what does it say about our like priorities and what we want out of translation? And I was thinking about, sometimes there's like small controversies in the translation world where, an established poet, let's say, is translating, and I'm going to say translating in scare quotes, from a language that she or he doesn't really have any familiarity with. And they're using an intermediary, a ghost translator to sort of to translate sort of in the background, and then they'll sort of translate it into poetry English, and then maybe they win awards, and this ghost translator is no longer mentioned as a collaborator. And I was just thinking about what that says about what we really care about when we read translation. That we really just want to read a text that's comfortable for us in English. And I say we, and I don't necessarily count myself towards this, but I mean, the English Anglophone readership, I think, values that fluency and that smoothness over almost everything else. And if you choose to try and disrupt, then you're maybe translating for a much, much smaller audience who is particularly interested in that and willing to go there. When I was living in the UK, I was often quite annoyed by the kind of discourse, and this may be controversial and I may not want to say this, but I remember a certain kind of attitude, which is like everyone can translate, and I am not trying to be a gatekeeper when I critique this, but I always felt like it said something very particular about England and the English literary scene, but also the kind of colonialist history of England, because I mean, traditionally so much translation has happened within academia, right? By amateur translators, professors of languages who are translating something because they're passionate about it. but the idea that because you can make a text sound good in English, i.e. you're a good writer, that therefore you can be a translator. And it's basically saying that the only criteria really is that you can make the text sound good in English, right? And I just always thought that emphasis was really telling and somewhat problematic. But yeah, as I was saying, it might just be that if you choose to be disruptive and you choose to to challenge that, I don't know how many people are going to be willing to go there with you. How many readers?
During some discussions that happen with Jan, I always tell him that I am an old school translator. I am all with the smooth text that people can just sit by the fireplace and read and enjoy. I'm now very in a phase of like blowing up the whole theory of translation and doing something very bizarre in this. But if I want to push English into some point, that wouldn't be, for me, it wouldn't be like breaking it and making it something very strange or very new. I would definitely push it to the point that I can introduce my own signature into it, not to make it very, just as Vala says, make it something that you kind of lose many of the audience. Because for me, at the end of the day, this translation is for the readers. We know some of our theories said that translations are not being done for the readers, but for me, translation is for the person that is going to read it and enjoy the literature, the essence of literature in it. So I would just introduce some of my own signatures into it, but I don't think I will ever have the confidence to like break the language altogether.
I guess my response to Vala's comment about disruptive texts being not very popular, isn't it a condition of the market in a sense? I think, didn't American publishing industry condition the reader to read and like very smooth, unproblematic texts? So it could be a matter of changing that. Of course, it's probably impossible, or very difficult, but there's also, like I mentioned, the taste makers earlier, critics, academics, other people, editors, publishers. I think there's a possibility to create a market where disruptive literature is interesting to people. Yeah.
I guess that we also don't want it to go too far the other direction and say, well, we're not interested in literature from this part of the world because all the texts we're seeing from there are too smooth or too familiar. So you don't want to set up more hurdles of like, not only do you have to get the attention of a publisher in Anglophone publishing and justify why you're working with them, you also have to then come up with something that's like very formally challenging and aesthetically interesting and pleasing. Like there's some aesthetic experience of complexity that is then going to be another requisite on top of everything else. So yeah, it's a danger, like everything in translation.
Other questions? Yeah.
Thank you. This is so wonderful. It's so wonderful to hear you guys talk. I think, it's very clear to me that you took something that sounds like a binary. First, you invented the second term, which is great. Then you problematized the binary. You said, well, maybe it's more like a spectrum, right? And I must say, like, I agree with Natasha. I think you need to push even further on this, right? So even more than a spectrum where you have like what this term does for us, what exophonic does for us is it implies a kind of language model where it's one language translated into another language. Do you have mastery of one language or another language? And that's not the world, yeah? Like languages, we all know, are plural. The borders between languages are fluid. They are political. They are enforced. Yeah. And so, for one thing, the exo of the exophonic might be other Englishes. Right. So exactly what Natasha's saying. And there's a proliferation of Englishes. And part of how this gets received could be that. It could also be on the other end of this, right? Like both languages are pluralized. So I'm curious your thoughts about this. I'll give you a concrete example just to sort of, so you can see why I think this is so important and keeps going. The best book I read in Afrikaans over the last 10 years, like by far, is a book called Kampun by a woman called Renelde Kamfer. And it's written in Afrikaans, but it's a dialect or not a dialect, depending on your political stance of this. That is COPS, that is racialized, that has a history, that has, so all those questions that we heard Corine talking about, preliminary about who can translate this, why can, what is the work that you have to do to translate that, absolutely come in. But even if I did all the work and I felt that I was the right person, can I represent that in English as just another Afrikaans? Yeah. So, you know, it's not language to language, it's languages to languages. So this exophonic thing, how does that, like, does that not explode it a little bit more? Is it capacious enough to accommodate a kind of language model where we're constantly enforcing borders? Borders are policed, right? Like, yes, I'd love to hear you guys just reflect about that a little bit. And maybe with, yeah, there are many Arabics, right? There are many, I'm sure you have your own sort of examples of this. Thank you.
The first thing that comes immediately to mind is, like, there are a couple of concepts in applied linguistics that seem to be arriving late into like literary criticism and literary discourse. And there's something of a communicative repertoire, which is the term that applied linguists use to challenge the firm distinction that people have between like language A and language B that they may speak. And it invites us to look at the complexity of contexts that people have with particular languages. So the study that I remember this being applied to was having to deal with indigenous languages and endangered languages in the United States, and in what contexts L2 and L3 learners of those languages were applying them in their daily life. And what these linguists ultimately realize is that we need to break down the idea of a multilingual person who has like these perfectly formed dictionaries of both languages in their minds. That's just not how it is. It may be that a person only has a word for a particular concept or relationship in one of the many languages that they speak in. So at that point, that person speaks one language, not multiple, right? And I think that that's something that we can sort of use to think, like, that puts into even sharper relief how much of an exterior category this is, and that it does not bear on the individual, and has, I think, to do more with like this structure of publishing and grants and residencies and citizenship and things.
I just wanted to sort of mention that I think the United States is like a particularly difficult environment in which to think about this, because it has like amazingly few dialects, and like I don't think that's controversial. I think given the size of the United States, it's sort of amazing how there's like a certain English that is going to work as well in New York as it is in California. A country like England, for example, is just like you can't take 10 steps without walking into a completely different English dialect. And I think for people who have come from other countries, this idea of very strict boundaries between languages just doesn't make any sense. In the same way that ideas of native languages start to make less sense, even in like Scandinavia or the Nordic countries, like the boundaries are just so much less strict, right? So for Americans, I think they're, without having to think about it very much, just are assumed to be very strong boundaries between languages that. Right. Okay.
It's also very strange for a country that, yes.
Yeah.
Right?
I think when we talk about this exophonic translation, we should ask a second question that what is the standard language? For example, what is the standard English language? What is the standard Arabic language? Because I think when we think about that, we will not come into a specific answer for that, because each country, each city, each state, each place that speaks this language can claim that our English, our language is the standard one. In my own country, Farsi is the official language of the country, but there are like 30 or 40 different dialects of this language that are being spoken. And there are books that are written in these dialects. And I always want to think that if I want to translate one of these books that are written in a certain dialect into English, how am I supposed to transfer the dialect into it? Because that dialect is actually telling the story, because that dialect is for a specific region that has a story behind it. How am I supposed to do that? So this talk of being exophone or being endophone has a question that comes before it. What is the standard language? How do you differentiate between these two? And I think we can't do that because it's just, there is no border. There is no, yes, we have a border around the country, but we can't have a border around the language. So we can't exactly say that. These are like a little bit, they become a little abstract, these questions. You can't have a concrete answer for them because the question is not concrete.
I think one of the things that we've been kind of like, I don't know if dancing around it is the word, but the thing that we haven't named is capitalism. And so even when you're talking about readership, it's like, is it the actual readership or is it what the capitalists imagine the readership to be, right? And the capitalism absolutely defines and puts borders around what is standard, right? It's why we can ask a bunch of undergraduate students what's the correct English in the United States, and they can say Midwestern, just like random Midwestern, whatever that means. It means nothing. It's like, right? And so I think I'm just wondering how conversations of capitalism come up in this field and in these discussions, especially in relation to editors and publications. Yes.
Okay. Okay. Yeah, I was thinking of similar things, and I was thinking of first of all, the way that translations don't sell. So an editor is saying, I won't sell this if it's odd. I mean, you're not going to sell 3,000 copies instead of 4, but that it always has been received knowledge, but also the way that unusual texts in so either there's the smooth translation, or I think that a lot of translation presses specialize in weird texts. So they don't want the standard, they want the weird, and that is also a market. And then I was also thinking of the way that writers who write in English are allowed to be more weird than the exophonic translator. So, I mean, many of you who teach translation have probably done this exercise, which I do with my students, where I just Xeroxed random pages from 12 books, 6 were translations, 6 were originals, and had them guess, and they frequently guessed incorrectly. So a writer like Ocean Vuong, right, who is an immigrant writer, but, his literary language is English. They were like, oh, it sounds weird. You wouldn't say it like this in English. And that's, right, Ocean Vuong is a best-selling, prize-winning author. And so the ways, yes, there are these sort of double standards about translation related to capitalism. I think that's right, that main idea that the market's defining what is good translation or what is allowed. So I'm very interested to hear, more about how capitalism plays into it, which is such a great thing to bring up.
Talk about capitalism.
Yeah, socialism. Yeah, I feel like like capitalism, but also like the real world is something that is kind of like the elephant in the room, and exactly something that we have to even dance around in our program when we're talking about what we do. I think we try to aim for some kind of ideal, and then we have like a class where like, unfortunately, we have to talk about how this really works and what you're going to face and what conversations you're going to have with your editor. Oftentimes, you know, during workshop, we'll be like, we know that an editor would cut this out, but let's let it be for now. So we're like striving towards an ideal that we know that we practically wouldn't be able to achieve, which is. Mhm. Replace the editors. Yeah. Step one.
Market and yeah, the purple goods from then for electronic journals. Pages need to sell anything. I mean, that's just the difference between markets, right?
I think it's like a larger problem in general that we need art to function in a market. And like as a publisher, I've come up against this and been really frustrated when I want to publish something and I know it's not going to sell very well, but I don't want to be driven by that because it's not what interests me. I didn't get into publishing to make money. Unfortunately, I got into publishing for all the wrong reasons. And so I have to sort of resent the market for not appreciating something that I think is very interesting. And I mean, in general, I think just like, yeah, I think we might in general need to sort of pull back on the expectation that art is going to be able to stand on its own in a market, and like funding, I think, needs to just accommodate that. And funding for translation is, I think, how most translations are published anyway, that they have some kind of funding attached to it. But I think it's like a larger question of like, why do we need art to prove itself in the market? And is that really how we want to judge the like quality of art?
So I definitely think capitalism is everywhere, like starting from cover letters or grant proposals or letters to publishers. You write it in a certain way that will sell the book or the translation to publisher. And even I think of this MFA as an exclusive path to this world where I can sorry, but I feel like it will position me better. So in a sense, I'm embracing capitalism, but as a tool in order later to disrupt it. I want to learn its ways and then and figure it out. Yeah, blow it up. Because I think if you know the ways of the system, you are, in a sense, are able to dictate some of the, yeah.
Yeah, it changes over the course of your career too as a translator, where when you're first starting out, you do kind of have to learn really well. Like there's a couple of little tools that we are trained, like you need to be able to have comp titles. So you have to know like this is going to sell because it has already sold in the form of these other writers. Or, you know, various ways of like pitching and getting people's attention and learning how that market structure has like how we get through that little gap in the wall. Older translators, more established translators, don't always have that problem. They can say, I want to release a new edition, like a beautiful edition of Madame Bovary or whatever, and they can go and do it. And sometimes those things sell because of who the translator is more than anything else. The other thing is that this is a problem faced by like all MFAs that are producing writers, even if they're writing in English. The types of writing that are encouraged by like the workshop model and the MFA model is shaped and in turn shapes like American publishing. So it's something that we have to deal with. But yeah, Vala's point about like grants and things, other nations like I can only speak to like Germany and Switzerland. Switzerland especially will really give a lot of money to get their texts out in the world. They don't care if it sells at all, but it will point people back to Switzerland in some way that like down the road there will be some like trickle down investment thing that will like be good for tourism or whatever. So like it's funny that this is acknowledged by like the nations and these cultural ministries themselves.
Perfect. I hate to cut this conversation off because there's so many more things to discuss, but we're at the end of our time. So thank you so much to our panelists and thank you to you all.